Happy New Year and welcome to the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. Hard to believe that we are wrapping up 2021. And having said that, what are we seeing in the markets? What's caused some of the weakness this week in the corn and the beans? Can we blame what we've seen in this trade on the fact that it is the holiday and many folks are just checking out, getting ready for New Year's Eve? We'll also look about the weather in South America. We know that in the last couple of days it's gotten a lot more attention. A story coming out of the state of New York, but more specifically the city of New York, and that is dealing with BioHeat and what it means with biodiesel and the opportunity maybe for some soybeans to see some positives as well.
It may be small, but this little bean fuels a lot of power. It powers a food industry as a top source of protein. It's a fuel that powers diesel engines with fewer emissions. It powers a state economy and bottom lines. And it powers the rest of the world as a top Nebraska export. Yeah, it may be small, but we're finding more ways for this little bean to power Nebraska.
Well, joining me as we welcome everybody back is Jeff Peterson. He is with Heartland Farm Partners, and Darin Fessler with Lakefront Futures. And first off, gentlemen, hope you both had a great Christmas and are looking forward to the new year.
It was a great Christmas, Susan, and Happy New Year to everybody. It's always great to get off to a new year and off to a new start.
I was just going to say, yeah, Christmas was great around here. We almost need a bigger house with all the carpet for what my son's going to be doing, but we got a lot of tractors out there, I tell you that much.
There's nothing wrong with that at all. As we look at these markets, gentlemen, and I know that we've been in a holiday type of trade, but still some craziness has been going on in this trade, something maybe we're not used to in that week between Christmas and New Year's. So, Jeff, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on what we're seeing in these markets?
You know, Susan, the trade this week is always interesting. We know we've got lighter volume than normal, and there's lots of different things to talk about out there. You know, we know we're coming into month end, quarter end, year end. So you've always got a little bit of dressing up of the market there. But, in addition to that South American weather's, just forefront in everybody's minds. And it's not that all parts of Brazil and all parts of South America are having weather problems. There's probably 85% of Brazil that's honestly in really good shape. And we're going to hear some really good yields coming out of those parts. But there is 15 to 20% that's seeing some dryness. But, here lately, like Paraná did pick up some rainfall, and that was forecasted maybe a little bit heavier than what some were expecting. And we got a little additional rain coming in, but then we'd look like we have some dryness down the road again. But then from a technical perspective, take corn, for instance, we ran that corn market up to 617 3/4 on the March. And that was an area we had not been up to since you'd have to go clear back into June, around June 11th. And then, and we'd actually had a move of about 55, 56 cents there since we'd had a major correction. So once that market kind of stalled out, we kind of, reversed it and traded down lower. And then once we have a little bit lower trade happening, you get some of the trend followers jumping in and some of the computer trading jumping in, and that just puts some sell pressure on it. And that's kind of where we're sitting right now, Susan.
Darin, do you think there's some concerns where we're at because the export numbers are kind of been on the quieter side? Many wondering if we're going to meet the demands or the phase one agreement with China?
Well, I have to agree with everything that Jeff had said there. I think that you're looking at the time frame of the year is the big one. You have probably positioning going on ahead of the January report, year-end date. And, to me, you look at the market in general, and Jeff's completely right. You look at how much this market has moved up here. We're basically trying to tag the point of control or the higher volume areas from that May to June timeframe, and we really got there. And so, to me, given how much this market had ran already, corn, beans, what have you, it was an opportunity for either hedgers to step in here, farmers to reward this from a cash side, or from a spec side to step in here and sell this, because we were overdone on both corn and beans. So it would given guys that had been long this market an opportunity and a reason to sell.
We see, and there's a lot of folks that are talking about Brazil, and I think both of you, we've done other programs that talked about, we're going to see this harvest taking place before the end of the year. End of the year is now, but I haven't heard any harvest information coming out. What are you guys hearing, Darin?
Yeah, the early harvest has started in Mato Grosso, but it's very, very early. I mean, there's not going to be a whole lot of significant harvest being done, but this is way earlier than they normally do. They usually first week, second week of January is usually when they start, but they got planted early here. Conditions have been pretty good. So what I'm looking for in Mato Grosso is how much does it rain? Do we start to see any type of harvest issues, infrastructure, or just the amount of rain that some of these areas are getting to maybe hinder some of that crop? I think that could add some fuel or maybe support to this market that has come off here a little bit. But overall, the majority of the harvest in Brazil is going to be into that, third week of Jan to the middle of February.
Jeff, what about you? What are you hearing from folks in South America, specifically with Brazil, and how much pressure is that going to put on getting this second corn crop in the ground?
Yeah, and I think Darin did a nice job of summing up exactly where it's at up in Mato Grosso. We are hearing some reports come out of Western Paraná in regard to some harvest getting started. And the only reason we're seeing some harvest there, what we had heard of is some 120-day soybeans that honestly were getting harvested at about day 90, and they've just ran out of moisture in those areas. And but overall, Darin had another very good point when he was talking about this wetness. We do need to keep an eye on that. Overall, the harvest up in Mato Grosso is ahead of schedule. We're probably 20, maybe 25 days earlier than we would have been last year. But as we've had happen in past years, this wetness can quickly turn into be a little bit of a problem for us. Could mean for some great yields, but it could mean some harvest problems. We're also seeing uncharacteristically in the northeast part of Brazil some wetness that's happening that could cause some issues with soybean quality going forward. So those are a few issues in addition to the dryness that's out there. And Darin was spot on in regard to, just when we're going to see the normal harvest get started, the market's going to be waiting for those beans very closely as it takes a while for them to actually get into the export channels.
Well, we are continuing with the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, which is being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. Darin, you posted some pictures and videos, I want to say right after Christmas or right around the Christmas time, that showed some of these crops in South America. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have a lot of contacts in both Brazil and Argentina, the agronomists, producers. I mean, I share information in our growing season. They share information in their growing season. And the majority of producers, I would say a good 80% of them, are pleased with how things look at the moment. I would say that for Argentina and most of Brazil. Obviously, the ones who have issues, they need some rain. The Paraná, the Rio Grande do Sul, the southern parts of Brazil obviously need some rain, but not all of those states in southern Brazil are having issues. I mean, there's spots that are really bad. There's spots that are really good in both of those states. I think we have to look at it from a holistic approach here. How does Brazil look? And as Jeff said, 80% is probably 85% is probably pretty good. If the rains return in southern Brazil, I think there's still a lot of producers that are optimistic that it's going to salvage what has been done. Is there a yield loss in those two states? For sure, there has been. But if the rains do come back, given the later planted stuff down there, it definitely could save the crop. I'm still looking for north of 140 million metric ton in Brazil.
So switching and looking at this story that came out of New York, Jeff, BioHeat and biofuel blending and heating oil is something that we've known a lot about in the Midwest. There's a big push, though, on the East Coast. And I was reading, and I'm going to glance away here so I get the numbers correctly. They say this will cut their petroleum diesel consumption by about 200 million gallons every year, utilizing BioHeat. And that's going to be soybeans that are coming right out of the Midwest.
Yeah, and it's an interesting story. It's one that continues to gain some traction. If you think back a few years ago when we had the big push with ethanol, and then at the same time we had the biodiesel being talked about, or in particular we were talking about methyl ester. But now what we're hearing a lot more discussion about is this renewable diesel. And from the renewable diesel side, that gets to be a bigger deal, because back on the biodiesel side, we were talking about, maybe a 3% blend or 13% blend. But then as we start talking about the renewable diesel, it's a different process. It gets involved. It's more likely very similar to what just regular diesel fuel is in the refinery process. And there you can be burning 100%. So what that really means is that it does take more, fat stock. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily just come from soybean oil. It can come from, tallow. Cargill's got a project that they're doing with Love's Truck Stop out around Hastings, Nebraska, where they're physically going to be taking tallow from some of their facilities and making renewable diesel. But there's going to be a developing story that doesn't just show up with what you talked about in New York and New York City, but we're going to hear more and more talk about it, because I'll give you an example, and this won't necessarily all come from just soybeans that would fuel this, but some are estimating that actually California market alone would like about 7 billion gallons or 7 billion pounds, or 7 billion gallons, I'll get it right yet, of the renewable diesel side. And if you went back and did the math on that, what that would actually suggest is that we need all of our soybeans crushed and turned into oil and meal. Now, we won't do that. We'll find other feedstocks that will work into that process, but just gives you an idea that there is going to be a lot of extra demand. Now, having said that, though, Susan, the thing we have to realize is that doesn't necessarily direct where prices are going to go today. That's just a story we got to keep an eye on as we go down the road.
All right. In 30 seconds, I want you to tell me, Jeff, what are you looking forward to watching in 2022?
Well, I think starting off here, we're going to watch South American weather very closely. We got to see how that crop finishes out, because Darin summed it up very nicely when he talked about the fact we can still have some very good yields coming out of there if the rains do go ahead and change and see some additional rains down in Argentina. But then we're going to have to keep a close eye also on the export demand coming out of the U.S. and also the ethanol demand on the corn side.
All right, Darin, what about for you? What's your go-to?
I'm looking at bean export, South American weather, and how does it relate at the end of the day to the inflationary type of trade that still is lingering on? Does the dollar versus the real, does it continue to start to weaken, or do we see the real start to increase a little bit versus the dollar, and how all of that relates to the grain market in 22?
All right, that has been this week's report. Just a reminder, commodity futures and options involve a substantial risk of loss and are not suitable for all investors. That's the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Report, being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff.